Welcome to The Human Edge. This week's guest is Rich Scott. Rich is CEO of Genomics England, which is a government-owned organisation. And we began by talking about what genomics is and why it's important in terms of healthcare. Rich is also a consultant doctor at Great Ormond Street Hospital here in London. And he explained why it's important for him to continue the clinical work in conjunction with his work as CEO. It was a really wide-ranging conversation covering a whole host of topics. For me, it was absolutely fascinating. I hope it is for you as well. And if it is, please share it with everybody you know. Please like on social media. And of course, please subscribe. It will be massively helpful. Thank you. So, Rich, you're the CEO of Genomics England. What is genomics?
So genomics it's a funny word, and it scares people off, I think, because it sounds really technical. Basically, your genome is the DNA code that is written, the 3 billion letters that tell your body how to grow, develop, and look after itself. Yeah. And genomics is the study of the genome, that DNA sequence, and particularly, from my point of view, it's the study of that can help inform and improve health. So how we use it in healthcare particularly.
Yeah. Is it a government-owned organisation?
It is, yeah. So Genomics England was set up now 11 years ago by the government because there was a big change in the potential of genomics that was recognised. What happened was, if you remember back, there was this thing called the Human Genome Project, which in around 2000 sequenced for the first time the first human genome. It took thousands of people, years, and billions of dollars or pounds, or however you measure it. Then in the 10 or so years following that, there's a real change in the way you can read DNA sequences, and this new era of machines came along that meant it was feasible, instead of it costing millions, in fact billions of whatever unit of currency and taking ages, you could actually see a future where this could be something that could be used in routine care. So the government wanted to run a project that was called the 100,000 Genomes Project to say, is whole genome sequencing, that's reading all of the 3 billion letters in your DNA code, is that something that is ready for use in routine care in the National Health Service? And how can we best do that, set it up and link it to research so that we keep learning? And Genomics England was set up initially to run that project, and then what we've done from there is to continue that mindset, saying how can we responsibly develop how genomics is used, working always with the NHS and supporting research to help us understand where this might help us in the future.
Are there genomics France and genomics, are there kind of similar organisations in other parts of the world, or is it fairly unique?
There are a bunch of different countries, over the years, and actually often looking at the UK model in terms of seeing how government investment can help countries be really on the front foot. And the UK is unusual in a bunch of ways. One way is it's always been at the forefront of genomics, and you think about things that lots of people know about genomics, like the structure of DNA. Oh yeah, that happened in the UK. Yeah. In fact, the first sort of DNA sequencing was also a Nobel Prize was won for it by some person from the UK called Fred Sanger. Again, the technology that changed this sequencing was invented in the UK. So there's a really long history of genomics in the UK. So we're on the front foot anyway, and there's real incredible expertise in the NHS and in research. The other thing that means that we're uniquely well placed, and it's why we at Genomics England always partner with the NHS, is we have a single national health service, which means that you can think about things much more holistically than most health systems or most countries. So there are a bunch of other countries doing and thinking about similar things. It actually turns out it's really hard to do, and we're really fortunate, not just because of the sort of proactive investment from government and the NHS, but also the way the UK and UK health systems are just set up, that we can do these things at real scale and ask really big questions in a way that's really important for genomics. It's important for genomics. Often doing things at scale is important in science. One of the really important things in genomics is that we're all so different from one another. And any two of us, you compare us, and now we can read genomes properly, you realise how different we are when you compare our genetic codes. That makes it really important that you can cross-compare lots of us to one another, even just to make sure that we're giving the right advice in routine care, let alone the best research. So again, that scale really matters, and it's one where we're really fortunate to be able to do the things we can and work with the NHS.
Is there an ethical dimension? You mentioned at the outset that the word scares people because they think it has connotations, but has there been a controversy around genomics, or are there kind of ethical implications to it?
There are lots of ethical questions. In fact, that's one of the things that's at the heart of what we do at Genomics England. And so I guess what we're trying to do, in fact, our vision as an organisation is a world where everyone can benefit from genomic healthcare. And that means we do a few different things. We have incredible data scientists and software engineers who can build systems that help people in the NHS and help researchers use data to improve health outcomes, present information to people sat in clinic to offer better care. We also run big research programs that ask big questions about how things might improve for the future, and critically develop evidence that can help make decisions about what the right approach is. That some of that is like hard science. Some of it is economics, or like health economics, people call it, where you say, is the investment you need, does it give enough return in terms of better patient outcomes or impact more broadly for the economy and so forth. But the third element, which is right at the heart of what we do and we have teams working on, is engaging with the public and with our participants in our research programs and patients to say, what do you think about how should we store your data? What are the red lines about who should access the data and for what purposes? And there's lots of very clear stuff that's been set down over years, either in just how you do healthcare research, or in fact there's a long history of ethics of how you use genomic data and expectations of its use by the public. So, for example, insurance companies do not have access to genomic data that people have tested routinely in healthcare or through our research programs. But there are lots of questions about how and whether you should, whether you should do certain things, and that's at the heart of what we do. And that's part of the evidence we generate as well. It's not just the science and the economics; it's also what the public attitudes and expectations are. Because these things, if you're making these decisions as a policymaker, and we at Genomics England aren't policymakers, we develop evidence for other people. But if you're a policymaker, you need that rounded view. And you're making policy on behalf of the public as well as from the other perspectives.
For some reason, I'm not quite sure why, but Dolly the sheep is coming to mind right now. Maybe I'm getting my things completely, my wires completely crossed. But was genome sequencing necessary in order for a sheep to be cloned? And is that one of the ethical considerations that we need to be, or you need to be really mindful of?
So I think the science that led up to the cloning of Dolly the sheep definitely was informed by knowledge of genomics. Actually, from my knowledge, it's predominantly a sort of laboratory sort of how do you get cells to grow in a particular way. Part of science. But you're right, it's those sorts of things, and they are in our consciousness sort of some of these things that have advanced in science over time, and there's potential, for example, now through genomics to do things like gene editing, where you change the sequence of particular parts of DNA, perhaps in certain cells, to improve health outcomes. And that's absolutely part of the sorts of discussion that need to be had if they're to be used.
That's not out there in the world. That's still under consideration.
So gene editing is used, for example, when you can now create bespoke treatments for someone's own cancer, where you take some of their own cells, you make some changes to give them a sort of a bespoke bone marrow transplant or cell therapy that can help. So those are things that are there.
Yeah.
In terms of what we do at Genomics England, our work is predominantly focused on understanding what reading the genome means, and then supporting the creation of better care plans and so forth. So far, actually, sort of thinking about some of those sort of elements, that's not something that's been relevant. There's loads of avenues that are really important. There are, though, some really clear distinctions about areas that are very sort of no-go. So, for example, gene editing related to the DNA that you might pass on to another generation is a no-go, and that's something which broadly sort of UK science is not going there on.
Yeah.
Our focus is definitely on sort of the ethics and so forth, but as I say, it's focused on where genomics is making a sort of a major impact at the moment, which is in sort of largely sort of a simpler territory. But there are lots of questions about, how do you store DNA, etc., or information about your genome and so forth. So to give one example, one of the programs that we're running at the moment is a newborn genomes program. We call it the Generation Study, where we're asking the question, can whole genome sequencing, so reading that full DNA code of babies at birth, help their care primarily through supporting screening for severe treatable conditions, just like the 9 or 10 conditions that are currently looked for in every baby on a heel prick. Yes. So they're conditions which cause very severe health problems, but you can do something to change the course. And rather than the 9 or 10 that are currently looked for in the UK, we think that you could probably look for a couple of hundred or so conditions if you used genome sequencing alongside the routine stuff. So we're running a big research study on that to see if that is something that we can do safely, and that it has positive outcomes, and it's in terms of the money that you need to spend, makes enough of a difference. A big part of that is saying what are public attitudes to that? What are people's expectations about that? So those are the sorts of questions which are big questions that are there for all of us. And that's, as I say, it's part of the evidence that we'll develop through the program.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. And you're still so you're a geneticist by trade, if I can put it like that. Are you still working as a doctor?
Yeah, so I trained originally as a doctor, and then through paediatrics, and then specialised in a part of medicine called clinical genetics. So I'm a consultant in clinical genetics at Great Ormond Street, and in my clinical practice, which I do just one clinic a month now, as well as my role at Genomics England. But in that I see children and families where they're suspected to have a rare condition. Rare conditions are often caused by some sort of genetic difference, and so genetics can help us make diagnoses. They're often quite severe conditions, and though, as their name suggests, they're rare individually, collectively they're quite common because there are 5,000 or 6,000 different rare conditions, which means they're hard to diagnose because it's quite hard to spot one from another often. But also, if you look at rare conditions overall, there's a statistic which says about 1 in 17 of us has one of these rare conditions. So it is, as I say, quite common, and therefore the use of genomics, which is now routine in the NHS, you can, for certain rare conditions, you can use whole genome sequencing to search for an answer that might have taken years, literally years, to find, or never been findable using some more conventional approaches.
I can imagine having kind of one foot still in the clinical work helps you in your role as CEO. It kind of maybe helps you helps you grounded. I'm not sure what the right way of thinking about it is, but as you say, you're seeing firsthand the effects of genetic differences or genetic defects, as they used to be called, and it kind of it's tying you to the work that you're doing as CEO.
Yeah.
Is that the way you think?
Yeah,
about
no,
it?
it's really important to me. I really enjoy it, and it helps me understand some of the choices we have, the impact in terms of the families and patients we see and their health service. So, I find it. I really enjoy it, and I think it really helps me have the right perspective on my other role.
When I was preparing for the interview, so I was thinking, you became CEO of Genomics England just a few months ago. You're responsible, I'm not sure what the head count is, 600 odd
About
people,
500.
500 odd people. Yeah. And I was thinking, what would the I don't know, 18, 21-year-old Rich think of the person sitting in front of me today?
I would definitely. It's funny. Even the 30-year-old Rich wouldn't have expected me to be doing this role. I guess I was very. I guess as a A-level kid, and probably even doing GCSEs, I knew I wanted to be a doctor. So I was very attracted by both the sort of parts of my brains you used understanding that science. I was very into genetics, interestingly, and making a difference to patients and the sorts of conversations that you need to have, often quite challenging to provide the best care for people. And I guess when you play forward, I realised that that's exactly what I'm doing now, and it's exactly why I was drawn to it, and that's why I've ended up doing what I'm doing, because that's where I see myself making the most difference.
Yeah.
But I definitely wouldn't have seen that. I wouldn't have been able to see it forward. And in fact, I have to say, and I think this is quite common amongst medics, is I actually had quite a negative attitude to any sort of, I would have called it management.
Yes.
And I just did air quotes.
Yeah.
And that was, and even before I joined Genomics England, nine or so years ago, nearly 9 years ago now, again, I didn't appreciate how much more of a difference I would be able to make in playing a slightly different role, and how much I enjoy it.
I wonder if that, because I'm sure that attitude about the suits still pervades, I would imagine. Does that mean that the likes of Genomics England then has to do better from a PR perspective or a comms perspective when talking to medics, on the ground doing the work?
Not necessarily for that reason, but I think sort of understanding. It's a dialogue thing, actually. Sort of understanding different people's worlds is really critical, and it's quite hard and it's why, going back to why I find it really important to still practice the things I learn, and the extra perspective I have from that really helps. I think it is within Genomics England, and thinking about people who, also just the conversations I have with, I quite like talking to young doctors, but people in any profession, about what they want to do. I love sharing the perspective and my old perspective, and helping people realise that there's lots of different skills you can use in different ways. And I think having an open mind and a growth mindset is the way to both sort of make the most difference for the world, and from my perspective, to enjoy it the most as well.
Yeah. And for those listening, watching, when you talk about growth mindset, what do you mean by that?
I'm no aficionado in growth mindsets, but I guess I just mean, because I think there's probably a whole school of thought behind what it formally means. But for me, it means having an open mind, being open to being told where you could improve, and enjoying finding and sort of working away at the areas that you know that you're less strong at and you want to focus on, and continuing to learn as a lifelong thing, and being a not yet person.
Yeah.
And I find it really chimes with what, again, sort of drives me and I think sits well with my understanding of how the world works, is that growth mindset point. And I see, and I see when I work with teams, whether it's within Genomics England or in the NHS or colleagues, or I watch my kids or whatever, it is the path to having the biggest impact on the world and being successful in what you want to achieve.
Yeah. Coming now to the most recent professional move you made from a senior role at Genomics England. By the way, is it genomics or genomics?
Either way.
Okay, I'll stick with genomics. Yeah. I'll stick with genomics. Yeah. Moving from that role into the CEO role, you and I have had a few conversations around this already, but it seemed to me from the outset that you were entirely comfortable stepping up in the way that you have and that you've been asked to do. Have there been any insecurities in kind of taking on that leadership role?
Yes, and I think that's right. It comes in different stages. I guess one thing, I was very fortunate in my previous roles to have been really supported in developing and thinking about what the next step might be. And so I had opportunities while I was the chief medical officer and then the deputy CEO to sort of understand what the role. In fact, I was then acting an interim CEO before I was appointed to the permanent post. So I had lots of opportunities along the way to learn and understand what the role entailed and to actually get over some of the anxiety about some of the difficult bits and also practice them in sort of safer territory. Yeah. The biggest challenge actually wasn't so much an insecurity one, it was just getting my head around the change that I made in terms of becoming someone who's predominantly acted through other people rather than myself as an expert. And that was actually happened sort of earlier in my time at Genomics England, and I found that quite a change and something I needed to get used to. The thing I'd say rather than insecurity, because it's the strength of accountability and the appropriate weight on your shoulders that you feel when you are accountable for something is the thing that I noticed the most as I made that transition. And as I say, I think it's really appropriate. So I don't think it's something to be shied away for or lessened, but it is different, and I find it quite clarifying, and it has helped me step back and then to make sure that I'm, if you like, again in inverted commas, worrying about the right things in a way that obviously is there in other roles, but when you sort of have that formal accountability, that's the biggest change. And I think, I think learning to be used to that feeling and knowing that it's right and you shouldn't run away from it is the sort of the biggest change.
Yeah. Do you feel that? It seems like you feel that responsibility, but you still wear it lightly. Would that be right?
Yeah, I don't know whether it's lightly, but I guess I know that I think I sort of totally accept and I'm trying to think of the word. I guess I feel that it's right to sort of lean into it and accept it, as you say, which is, I think, slightly different from lightly. I know it's slight semantics, but it's, and I also think I think there's a world in which in any role it's quite easy to think, I shouldn't be feeling this. Maybe I'm not the right person for the role, and it's right to always question it, and that's part of the sort of growth mindset thing. But I also think in this regard, in the sort of the sense of that that responsibility, actually it means you're right for the role if you feel it,
yes,
rather than feeling that that's something that makes you less suitable for it.
Yeah.
If you see what I mean.
Yes, to use maybe a strange analogy, in the same way that I don't know, if an elite sports person might feel nerves before going on the pitch, they know that it's because they care, it's because they feel the responsibility.
No, that's right. I've told you before, I used to run a lot.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on that.
I think recognising where it's right that you have these emotions and feel things strongly, and it's right, and in fact useful, is a really important thing. And then always emotions that are, or feelings that you naturally lean into, but they are, I think, recognising that, I think, and I do see a lot of analogies there.
Are you, because I know you, so carrying on with the theme of running, I know you are very competitive as a runner, and I wonder whether that kind of pervades all aspects of your life. So are you equally competitive in the professional landscape?
I'm very outcome focused. And in running, in fact, one of the reasons I stopped running competitively was because I tired of the sort of self-centered focus of those outcomes, because I did run for a team, but primarily it was sort of personal. And I am, like, if I focus on an outcome and I believe I want to achieve it, then I am very driven, and I tap into the passion and the so forth that really drives me. It does, and that the same thing drives me at work in terms of those outcomes. And then what attracts me about my role, and roles in the sort of the sector that I work in, is that I really buy into the outcomes that we're focused on, like at a grand scale, whether you're seeing an individual patient.
Impactful,
exactly.
Right? Yeah.
And so that feels like a much better use of the drive that I do have, that I could use in other directions.
Yeah. What I'm thinking about at the moment is, so you have that drive, you're very impact focused, very results focused, you're the CEO, but in any organization, there will be people who don't have the same degree of drive and motivation as you do. So how do you think about that, bringing people that are working for you or working for those that are working for you along the journey to ensure that you get the results you want?
I guess a lot of it is actually genuinely, in thinking about the right people for different roles, is you want people to have ambition, and you want them to have the right sort of ambition, which is a sort of funny phrase, but it's one that I quite like, where they're focused on the outcomes that the organisation
and not on themselves
wants to achieve first, and know that personal ambition is supported by driving for organisational or in fact, one of the great things that I really enjoy about working for Genomics England, often it's the sort of ecosystem. It's like the UK benefit overall that comes, rather than it necessarily being Genomics England individually. It's about us working as part of like a broader team. So I actually think creating an environment that attracts people with that right sort of ambition is right, and I think recruiting and nurturing people with ambition is right. And then I think it's one of the things we're really lucky about is the nature of our mission is very attractive to people, and I think sort of that's thing one. Thing two is then being really clear on what our goals are collectively in the organisation and sort of for the different parts of the organisation. And then I think two is creating the right environment in which people can actually achieve those, and that is definitely where growth mindsets need to be there always, because you should never be satisfied. And we'd spend a lot of time, and are spending a lot of time thinking about how we create that, because it's not just enough to have ambitious people focused on the right goal. You need to create an environment where they can actually make a real difference and don't get frustrated and so on.
I think I read recently that this again in the context of elite sport, that 80% of performance is determined by environment, and I'm sure it's the same in any walk of life. And when you, again, it's really interesting to me thinking about this. You have an organisation of 500 or so people, so that's it's not huge, but it's of a size where creating the kind of culture that you're talking about might be challenging because of its relative size.
Yeah.
So how do you think about creating a culture that is fit for what you're doing now, but also can scale as the organisation grows in the future?
So I guess I'd think less about scaling as an organisation, because I'm not sure necessarily that we will. We don't have ambitions to grow in number. We have ambitions to grow in impact. But I do think culture is critical, whatever size you are, and it's also one where it's incredibly hard to. You don't sit down one day and say we're going to change our culture to X or Y or Z. So it requires real thought and care and. Like trust, it's easily set in a wrong direction, easily lost, but slowly won. And so one of the things that I've been spending quite a lot of time thinking about since I took on the role, and also talking about, is like what the right culture and what the real key elements of it are for us. And as I say, as an organisation, we're really fortunate to have a mission that many people buy into, and that's wonderful. As with any organisation, there's sort of particular nuances that really come to play. And one of the things we've been thinking about a lot is, we operate in a healthcare environment which is appropriately highly regulated, because you need to, if you're offering services into a health system, you need to know that they live up to certain accreditations and standards and so forth. And you basically that you've tested them to appropriate levels to avoid errors, and we're holding very precious data on behalf of. It's not our data; it's the people's data which we're holding, and we've made promises to them. So again, high standards
and highly regulated, and fast-moving world where we need to hold data in the right way, be secure in various ways. At the same time as those things which say, first, to reuse a sort of medical term, first do no harm, be cautious, and show this sort of integrity and live up to those standards. At the same time, we're in a fast-moving environment. We're there to innovate, to develop evidence on change, to think big, to learn fast, which you only learn fast through making mistakes. And those two things are potentially in opposition, unless you think really carefully, both at a cultural level but also like a technical level, about how you provide safe environments where you say, when we're offering live services to the NHS, or we're holding up participant data, this is the hat you're wearing, these are the standards you operate to. When you're innovating in these ways, in systems which are clearly separated from those others, and there are clear ways that you can test and learn and iterate. This is this is how you really push the boundaries and learn fast. And I think having that, it's a tension that I think we didn't surface actually until quite recently as an organisation in terms of talking about it. And I think by talking about it in a cultural sense, but also then thinking about what that means from quite a technical sense. For example, how our technology systems work is really important, and actually then impacts the culture as well. So the other thing to say about culture is it comes from every part of the organisation, including the top. And I think so making sure that you hold people to account in any part of the organisation in terms of living up to the standards you expect is critical. Yeah, it's one of the hardest things to get right, I think, in so many organisations. In so many organisations, there are words on the wall, but the behaviours that you need to attribute to the values, the principles are not enshrined in the business, and I suppose that's I'm not suggesting that your behaviours aren't aligned, but that's the challenge, right? In creating the culture that you're trying to create. In terms of just kind of changing tack a little bit, it's something I've been thinking about recently, which is authenticity at work and bringing your whole self to work. Decades ago, there was a clear separation between someone's work persona and their private life persona, but now we're seeing a kind of a merging, and people perform better when they're authentic. They're being their authentic selves at work. I wonder whether for the CEO, whether a CEO can bring their whole self to work in the same way that maybe someone lower down the organisation can. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I actually thought a chunk about in terms of the transition into my new role is how much to share about, like, why, what motivates me, which, as I've said, I'm driven in a sort of passionate sense. I often get quite emotional about work, about the impact we can have, and actually one of the other things that I really find makes me emotional is seeing people at work grow and have an impact themselves, and I think sharing that, and I don't know whether quite what my whole self is. I don't spend enough time introspecting maybe to think about all of the aspects of myself, but I do think being like sharing what motivates you, why you're thinking what you are, is like, again, it's sort of I think it's an easier. It feels like the path to getting the most out of yourself, to be honest, but also to helping other people understand like where you're coming from, but also sort of share, be motivated by what's behind it. So I guess I didn't lead organisations in the 1980s, but I can see that I think I would have really struggled to enjoy it or actually have an impact in the right way. So I really buy into it, and I think obviously there are areas where there needs to be a separation, and in certain circumstances like deep professionalism, and I guess that's something that as a doctor I've been quite used to, and I would have thought probably inhibited me early in sort of perceiving myself as a leader at Genomics England, because as a doctor in clinic, you're there for, it's not about you, it's about the family, and there's that's absolutely right and really important. And of course you do show empathy and compassion, but this is not about you bringing your life into that family's life at that moment. And I think that formalism is right in certain contexts, and in other contexts it can be relaxed a bit more.
You talked earlier, and I don't know if there are any parallels between having hard conversations with patients and patients' families, and those conversations, they may, they're life or death potentially conversations. Now in your new role, you may be having to have different difficult conversations, which may be emotional for different reasons. Maybe you're having to let someone go, for example, or there's whatever it might be. Do you think your clinical experience, helps you when thinking about having to have difficult conversations in a more corporate organisational sense? Yeah,
I think it does. I don't think it necessarily makes. I think it's something that you learn in a particular context in medicine, and it took me a while to recognise those parallels. Weirdly, it's something that I've only sort of really called out in my own head to myself more recently. But I think in medicine, often there's no choice. You have to the next task is for this patient or this family is you need to talk to them about something, and they need to understand it now because it's their information, or they need to make a decision now. And there's no shying away from it, and there's a sort of clarity to that, and so you do learn to do that. And I think sometimes in in a corporate or a business setting, it can be easier to put things off sometimes. So I think sort of learning not to, and having that helping, being comfortable that actually the best thing typically is to have the conversation. Whether it's, I think the biggest one is about performance. People often find it hard to give harsh feedback about areas where people need to grow or focus. That's exactly what you owe the person, and it's what they deserve so that they can focus on these areas. But it's quite easy to shy away from them. So I do think it helps. I've also find I have better conversations with patients and families, having played my role at Genomics England. And again, that's something I sort of wondered about recently. But I think that so much of medicine it's also partly a sort of getting the passage of years, but like focusing on the conversation you need to have with people is the critical thing, whatever walk of life you're in.
Yeah, I wonder whether, as you said, the passage of life, of time, of becoming more confident in yourself and who you are. You've kind of stepped up and stepped up and stepped up, and so now you're having conversations at really kind of high levels, complex issues, difficult conversations, so that when you come back to the clinical work, you're taking the benefit of that experience into the conversations you're having with patients or families.
I think it's funny in all sorts of, like, whatever you're doing, whether it's tricky conversations or thinking about some very complex task that you have at hand, or performing in some other way, if you're musical, I'm not musical, or in sport. What the thing of being able to focus on the matter at hand and be clear on the 2 or 3 things that actually matter here is really the thing that is a real skill, and I think is quite transferable. And I think it's partly, for me, I feel like it's a passage of time thing, because it's relevant in all sorts of different areas. But I think that ability
you've learned.
Probably, and I couldn't tell you which settings, and it's probably it's just one of those things that has changed over time, and I don't quite know where I've learnt it most. But I think that being able to sort of be in the zone of a particular conversation, and likewise being able to give yourself to a conversation with someone, whether it's like helping them to, in a coaching sense, work through problems or whatever, that ability to really focus out the noise and be really present in the conversation and think about the things you need to add, rather than worrying about what you might be about to say that might be wrong, or whatever that might distract you, or the thing that's in the next meeting or was in the last meeting. I think that's a really important skill. And
it reminds me of a conversation for the podcast I was having earlier today about kind of being the importance of being in the moment for mental health reasons, especially. So I was curious. You're very driven. You're very solution focused on the impact. Do you find it hard to switch off when the working day? Well, the working day may never be done. But when you leave the office at whatever time it is, you find it difficult to switch off.
Yeah, it can be. I am able. It partly comes from the sort of the focus thing, to like switch and sort of decide. I'm thinking about X. So that skill also helps in deciding when to switch off. And I'm fortunate, I guess, for example, I sleep really well, because when I decide to go to sleep, I decide to go to sleep. And but I think when things are important to you, then they're in your mind. And so I think that is hard. And I've definitely, when I was younger, when I was very driven to succeed at, say, medical exams, and I learned actually through sort of painful experience at university. One year, my second year in undergrad, I worked so hard, and I actually had sort of like an anxietal episode, because I just couldn't. That was all I was doing. It was all I was thinking about.
Yes.
And it really
couldn't switch off.
I couldn't switch off, and it really it really educated me and taught me the importance of giving yourself time out, doing exercise, stopping work at a reasonable time, etc., etc. And I was actually, I think before that I was quite arrogant about saying, no, I'm fine, I can do what I like. It was a real wake-up call, and it's really, it was when I was 19 at the time, and it's so formative, that experience for me, and then has helped me embed the importance of finding space in various ways ever since.
Yeah. Is that something, coming back to the cultural piece that you're talking about, is that important to you in terms of one of the cultural elements for Genomics England? Yeah,
I mean, we work to make a big difference to our partners and the patients, and the participants, and you can only do that if you have an effective workforce that looks after their mental health, doesn't take it as a given, who are able, you don't make unreasonable expectations of people. We have, for example, we do need to cover stuff out of hours, but doing that in a sort of carefully thought through way, so that the cover is set up in a way that is sort of works with people's working practices and so on. Is absolutely critical, and what you want is a workforce is looked after and set up in a way that for their lives is sustainable as well.
Yeah. One thing I'm particularly interested at the moment in a lot of conversations I'm having is the topic of spirituality, and I wondered whether the work you do is clearly very technical, clinical, but is there room for spirituality in the conversation?
I think as I said, when one of the things that is critical to our work is engaging the public, with the participants, the people whose data we hold. We have a participant panel, for example, who are part of our governance, and for example sit on the independent access review committee who decides who should have access to data to do what. And I think when in developing evidence or designing us on how you might use genomics in the system in the future, or thinking about how we improve how we work today, you need to. Part of that conversation is about people's own views on all sorts of things, including their own spirituality, their religion, other views that they have personally or as part of their community or family. So that's definitely part of the conversation. It's not one where we, Genomics England, bring a view, or I bring a personal view, but thinking about this in the context of people's real lives and their own views is absolutely critical. And not pretending that that you could do otherwise, to me seems strange, and so that is very much part of it. So working with community groups and so forth is really important to us.
I don't know how far into the future you think, you dream, you vision, but what do you think the next, let's say, 5 years holds for you and for the organisation?
We've been spending quite a lot of time the last year or so thinking about where genomics as a field, and in the UK particularly, will go in terms of the impact in healthcare. And after that comes the other bits, us as an organisation and me as an individual. Yeah. And I've told you a bit about genomics, and to tell you a tiny bit more, and then where we might go is, at the moment, the UK is doing an incredible job in genomics. The NHS is doing an incredible job, and part of our job is to support them and researchers. Genomics is currently really important in the care of people with rare conditions. 1 in 17 people, quite a lot, really important there. And in people with cancer, which is increasingly common as we age as a population. The potential there's lots of room for improvement in both of those areas. There's amazing new sort of therapies. There's these things called cancer vaccines, for example, that have just come out using the same technology as the mRNA COVID vaccines. There's new treatments for rare conditions coming around the corner, and that will be really important for us and the people we help. Actually, genomics has a much broader potential impact, where at the moment it's very important in certain parts of healthcare. In 5 or 10 years' time, I see a future where actually genomics can be a routine part of healthcare, full stop, and much more like the fabric of healthcare. And to give one example that we're keen to explore in the next few years is there's lots of variation in our DNA code that dictates how we respond to and digest, metabolize certain medicines, in fact lots of medicines. And there's a field which has got a sort of jazzy, doctory, medically name, which is pharmacogenomics, which basically means looking at your DNA to work out what dose or what medicine to give. And by looking at, if you pick people going into a GP or a hospital appointment, about half of those appointments might, knowing your DNA sequence, could help inform the advice that you're given in that appointment because of this pharmacogenomics knowledge, which is already there. It's quite challenging to deliver because you need the information right there, right then, in the conversation before it's finished, because you can't stop the whole of healthcare because you need to wait a month for a test or even a few hours. You need to have it there and then. So there's lots to work through about how you deliver it, who you prioritise actually using this and so on. But that's an example of one area where actually genomics is if we do the right things in terms of developing the right evidence and the right technical infrastructure, genomics could just become very much part of everyday healthcare. In fact, because your genome doesn't change through life, you can use and reuse the same data, and that works well with it being used rapidly. In whatever setting, in a pharmacy or a GP or whatever. That's where genomics could go, and it could also be useful in predicting risk of common disease potentially. There's research going on that, how you best could use it. And so our role is to sort of play those the roles we currently play, which is like building systems that work at national scale for quite chunky sized data, making sure it's available in the right places and the right formats at the right times to inform care. So like building systems which currently they don't, nowhere in the world is set up to do that. So we're really well placed to work with the NHS and play our role in supporting the sort of genomics-y, techie bits of that, developing evidence on how you do this, including engaging with the public on what the expectations are around it, how that data should be stored. And so there's loads for us to do in sort of asking those big questions about how genomics is used, and if you like, being a data and evidence engine for genomic informed healthcare, so that I'd say in 10 years' time, the place to be would be that genomics is part of the fabric of healthcare, designed in a way that people are really bought into and in fact sort of been part of the design of, and that's really we're uniquely placed in the UK to do that, for the reasons I said earlier, not least on National Health Service and the sort of the infrastructure and know-how we have in genomics. And I'm really excited. I feel like we're at the beginning of a journey, even though that I'm really proud of the impact we've had already for sort of thousands of families and patients. But actually, we're just in the foothills. There's a lot to do, and it's not all just one foot after another. It's about exploring and doing that in consultation with the public and experts and so on. It's incredibly exciting, and that's why I'm excited about my job now and for a good while into the future.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you've arrived in the CEO position at just the right time. One exciting journey ahead, and I look forward to hearing all about it as you go. But thank you for coming in. It's been really, really fascinating conversation. I've loved every minute of it.
It was a pleasure. I've enjoyed the conversation too. Good. Thank you.